The impetus of their drive carried them swiftly up the slope and into the breaking ranks of the defenders, then through the line of guns whose cannoneers scattered, and onto the crest. They did not stay there long. Gibbon and Hayes had him greatly outnumbered as well as outflanked on the right and left, and Meade had already ordered another 3 divisions to converge on a threatened point from Cemetery Hill, 3/4 of a mile to the north, and Culp's Hill, about the same distance across the eastern valley. But while they were there, Wright believed that he had victory within his reach. On the reverse slope, bluecoats were streaming rearward across the tiny town road, and half a mile beyond it, the Baltimore pike was crowded with fugitives. Yet these were only the backwash of the battle. Nearer at hand, on the left and right, he saw heavy blue columns bearing down on him, and he saw, too, like Wilcox and Lang before him, though they had achieved no such penetration of the main Union line, that to stay where he was unsupported meant capture or annihilation. He ordered a withdrawal, which was achieved only by charging a body of Federals who had gained his rear by now, and then fell back across the Emmitsburg Road, taking punishment all the way from the 24 guns he'd captured and then abandoned. Like Wilcox and Lang, Wright had lost nearly half his men in that one charge, and he found this a steep price to pay for one quick look at the Union rear, even though he believed ever after that the end of the war had been within his reach, if only he'd been supported while he was astride the crest of Cemetery Ridge, midway of the Yankee line, and within plain sight of the cottage Meade was using as headquarters for his army. The hard fact that no supports were at hand when the Georgians crested the ridge and stood poised there, silhouetted against the eastern sky for one brief fall of time as they pierced the enemy's center, did not mean that none had been available. Though Posey and Mahone had hung back, declining for whatever reasons to go forward, the former calling a halt halfway across the valley, and the latter refusing to budge from the shade of the trees on Seminary Ridge directly behind Lee's command post, there still was Pender, whose division was to the 3rd Corps what Hood's and Johnston's were to the 1st and 2nd, the hardest hitting and fiercest of the 3. And yet Pender was not there after all, not Pender in person. Like Heath and Hood at about the same time yesterday and earlier today, he'd been unhorsed by a casual fragment of shell while riding his line to inspect and steady his men for their possible share in the attack then rolling northward. The wound in his leg, though ugly enough, was not thought to be very serious, or at any rate not fatal, but it was. 2 weeks later, the leg was taken off, infection having set in during the long ambulance ride back to Virginia, and he did not survive the amputation. "Tell my wife I do not fear to die," the 29-year-old North Carolinian said in the course of his suffering, which was intense. "I can confidently resign my soul to God, trusting in the atonement of our Lord Jesus Christ. My only regret is to leave her and our children." If this had the tone of Stonewall Jackson, under whom Pender had developed into one of the best of all Lee's generals despite his youth, his last words sounded even more like his dead chief. "I have always tried to do my duty in every sphere of life in which Providence has placed me." Few doubted afterwards that he would have done that duty here today at Gettysburg by leading his 4 brigades across the valley to assault the ridge just north of where Wright had struck it. There was, in fact, little to stop him once he got there. Not only had Hancock shifted his 2 divisions south to counter Anderson's attack, Meade had also moved Newton's 2 in that direction from their position supporting Howard on Cemetery Hill. But that was beside the point, as it turned out. The decision whether to join the charge had been discretionary anyhow, according to Lee's orders, and when Pender was hit and carried off the field, his temporary successor, James Lane, having watched Anderson's 2 adjoining brigades falter, decided that it was no longer advisable for his troops to advance, since they would not be supported on the right. Moreover, A.P. Hill was not there at the time, having ridden northward to confer with Rhodes, and did not urge Lane on. With that, the 3-hour-long assault on Cemetery Ridge broke down completely. Hood, McLaws, and Anderson, some 22,000 men in all, including the cannoneers, had tried their hands in sequence against a total of no less than 40,000 blue defenders. Better than 7,000 of the attackers had fallen in the attempt, and all they had to show for this loss of 1/3 of the force engaged was the Devil's Den, plus a peach orchard, which had been proved to be practically indefensible in the first place, and a few acres of stony ground on the floor of the valley between the ridges. The whole affair was disjointed, a member of Lee's staff admitted later. There was an utter absence of accord in the movements of the several commands. The truth was, the Army had slipped back to the disorganization of the 7 days, except that here at Gettysburg there was no hardcore tactical plan to carry it through the bungling. There was, in fact, scarcely any plan at all, Lee's instructions for an attack up the Emmetsburg Road having been rejected out of necessity at the start. This, together with the refusal of the Federals to panic under pressure, as they had done so often before when the Graybacks came screaming at them, had stood in the way of victory. And yet, in light of the fact that each of the 3 attacking divisions in turn had come close to carrying the day, there was more to it than that. Specifically, there was Warren and there was Hancock, both of whom had served their commander in a way that none of Lee's chief lieutenants had served him. Warren had acted on his own to save Little Round Top and the battle, and Hancock had done the same to prevent a breakthrough, first at the lower end and then at the center of Cemetery Ridge. But no one above the rank of colonel, Oates the exception, lacked the authority to make it count, had acted with any corresponding initiative on the other side. There was, as always, no lack of Confederate bravery, and the Army's combat skill had been demonstrated amply by the fact that despite its role as the attacker, it had inflicted even more casualties than it had suffered. Yet these qualities could not make up for the crippling lack of direction from above and the equally disadvantageous lack of initiative just below the top. Longstreet sensed a good part of this, perhaps even his own share of the blame, at least to a degree, but once more his reaction was a strange one. Though he was saddened by the wounding of Hood and the death or capture of Barksdale, which he believed were the main reasons he had failed to break Meade's line, he was by no means as gloomy as he had been in the course of the roundabout march into position. "We have not been so successful as we wished," he told an inquirer, and that was all he said. He seemed glad for once that his share of the fighting was over. If Hill had broken down, it was not his fault. He had small use for Little Powell anyhow. And now the battle passed to Ewell. Stung by Lee's complaint that he'd failed to pursue our advantage of yesterday, Ewell was eager to make a redemptive showing today despite the difficulties of terrain on this northern quarter of the field. After Lee departed, he'd kept busy all through what was left of the morning and most of the afternoon, inspecting his 3 divisions, which were disposed along a convex arc on 3 sides of Gettysburg, Rhodes to the west, Early just south, and Johnson to the east, confronting the 2 dominant heights at the bend and barb of the Union fishhook. His instructions required him to guard the Confederate left, keeping as many bluecoats occupied there as possible, and to stage a vigorous demonstration by way of ensuring that effect when Longstreet's guns began to roar at the far end of the line. Moreover, and this was the prospect he found most attractive in connection with his desire to make a showing, if Ewell decided he could strike with a fair chance of success, he was to convert the demonstration into a real attack, driving the enemy from Cemetery and Culp's Hills, which commanded the Tiny Town Road, and the Baltimore Pike, both vital to the Federals if they were thrown into retreat from these 2 northern heights and the ridge leading southward to the Round Tops. The wait was a long one, anxious as Ewell was, and sometime after 4 o'clock, when the distant booming at last informed him that Longstreet's artillery preparation had begun, he decided to respond in the same fashion. 6 batteries, held under cover till then by Joseph Latimer, Johnson's 20-year-old chief of artillery, were sent to the crest of Benner's Hill, a solitary eminence 1 mile east of town, with orders to pummel Culp's Hill half a mile southwest across the valley of Rock Creek. Ewell felt that this would not only serve as a vigorous demonstration, fixing the blue defenders in position as required, but would also afford him an opportunity to study their reaction and thus determine the advisability of launching an all-out uphill infantry assault. The answer was both sudden and emphatic, as might have been expected if a proper reconnaissance had been made. Banner's Hill was not only 50 feet lower than the height across the way, it was also bald, which meant that the 24 guns found neither cover nor concealment when they went into action there, whereas the Federal cannoneers had spent the past 20 hours digging lunettes and piling up embankments to add to the security of their densely wooded battery positions. Lashing their teams up the reverse slope of the isolated hill, the Confederates opened fire from its crest soon after 5 o'clock, and within a few minutes of the prompt and wrathful response by the heavier guns directly across the valley, as well as by those a mile away on Cemetery Hill, it was obvious that there could be no doubt as to the outcome of the duel, but only as to how long it could be sustained against the odds. Starkly exposed on the naked summit, the gray gunners stood to their work under a deluge of hot metal and amid sudden pillars of smoke and flame reared by exploding caissons. After about an hour of this, Latimer, who was known as the Boy Major and was said to be developing fast into another Pelham, felt compelled to send word that his position was untenable, a thing he'd never done before in the 2 years since he'd interrupted his sophomore year at VMI to join the Army. Johnson at once authorized him to withdraw all but 4 of the guns, which were to remain there in support of the attack Ewell had just ordered all 3 of his divisions to make, despite this graphic evidence of the fury they were likely to encounter as they approached the hilltop objectives he assigned them. Latimer's withdrawal was necessarily slow, his crews having been reduced to skeletons by the counter-battery fire, and he himself was mortally wounded before it was completed, a high price to pay for confirming what should have been apparent before the one-sided contest even began. On the face of it, the infantry attempt seemed equally doomed. Actually, this was not the case, however, for the paradoxical reason that Ewell had failed in his primary mission of holding the blue forces in position on his front. By 6 o'clock, when the attack order was issued, Meade had taken thorough alarm at the series of threats to his left and center, and by 7 o'clock, when the advance began against his right, he had shifted 2 of Newton's 3 divisions southward, together with all but a single brigade from the 2 divisions in Slocum's corps. All that remained by then on Cemetery Hill, which Early and Rose were to assault in sequence from the north and the northwest, were the 3 battered divisions under Howard, while Culp's Hill was held even more scantily by Wadsworth's division of the 1st Corps, down to half its normal strength after yesterday's drubbing on Seminary Ridge and the 1 brigade Slocum had left behind. That was where the paradox came in. If Ewell had succeeded in holding the departed Bluecoats in position, as Lee had instructed him to do, the attack would have been as suicidal as any ever attempted by either army in the whole course of the war. But as it was, with the defenses manned only by Howard's jumpy Dutchman, Wadsworth's thin line of survivors from the rout of the day before, and the single brigade from Geary's division, the chances of a Confederate breakthrough here on the north were considerably better than fair, despite the obvious difficulties of the terrain. For one thing, thanks to Meade's alarm at the unrelenting fury of the 3-hour-long assault on the Round Tops and Cemetery Ridge, Ewell's troops outnumbered the defenders to their front, an advantage no other attacking force had enjoyed on any portion of the field today. Johnson's division, which had arrived too late for a share in the battle yesterday, had remained in the same position for nearly 24 hours, a mile east of Gettysburg and north of the Hanover Road, its 4 brigades posted from right to left under J.M. Williams, John M. Jones, George H. Stewart, and James A. Walker. The men of the 1st were Louisianians, and the rest were nearly all Virginians, like old Clubby himself, who took them forward at 7 o'clock, brandishing the post-thick hickory stick from which his nickname was derived. That left half an hour till sunset, but they had more than a mile to go, and armpit-deep rock creek to cross before they came within musket range of their Culp's Hill objective. As a result, the sun was well down behind it by the time they came surging up the northeast slope, yelling fiercely as they approached the crest. They did not make it all the way. Wadsworth's troops, including the remnant of the Iron Brigade, were well dug in and quite as determined as they'd been when they shattered Heath's attack the day before. Jones was wounded early in the fight, and his and Williams' men, unsupported because Walker and his famed Stonewall Brigade remained in reserve on the far side of the creek, had all they could do to keep from being driven off the hillside. Around to the left, Stuart had better luck, the trenches down the southern nose of the hill having yawned vacant ever since Slocum's departure, half an hour before the rebel advance got underway. The gray attackers swarmed into and along them, whooping as they swung northward in the twilight, apparently unopposed, only to strike a new line of fortifications drawn at right angles to the old and occupied by the brigade Slocum had left behind. The struggle here was as bitter as on the right, and the defenders, 5 regiments of upstate New Yorkers under George S. Greene, fought with a determination every bit as grim as Wadsworth's. Rhode Island born, with a seagoing son who had served as executive officer on the Monitor, Greene was 62, a few months older than the ineffectual Barnes, and therefore the oldest Federal on the field. Old Man Greene, his soldiers called him, or sometimes merely Pop, for though he had finished second in his class at West Point 40 years ago, he affected an easy style of dress that made him look more like a farmer than a regular army man. What he was, in fact, was a civil engineer. He'd left the service early to build railroads and design municipal sewage and water systems for Washington, Detroit, and several other cities, including New York, whose Central Park Reservoir was his handiwork, along with the enlarged high bridge across the Harlem River. Such experience as he applied it now to laying out entrenchments stood him and his 1,300 men in good stead this evening on Culp's Hill. Rather than attempt to hold the empty trenches on his right with his 1 brigade, which would have stretched beyond the breaking point, he had dug a traverse midway of the line and facing south behind a 5-foot thick embankment of earth and logs. Here his troops fought savagely, holding their own against Stuart's frantic lunges, and were reinforced at last by 2 regiments Wadsworth was able to spare when the pressure eased on the north end of the hill. When the commander of the first of these reported to him on the firing line, the battle racket was so terrific that Greene had to give up trying to shout above the uproar and instead wrote his name on a card which he handed to the colonel by way of identification. For 2 hours, from twilight well into darkness, the firing hardly slacked. Then gradually it did, dying away to a sputter of individual shots, as if by mutual agreement that the blind slaughter had grown pointless, as indeed it had. Johnson was forced to content himself with what was after all a substantial lodgment on the far Union right, and Greene was more or less satisfied that he'd been able to keep it from being enlarged, though it was clear to the fighters on both sides that the lull would not last past daylight. Although it started later and ended sooner, Early's attack on Cemetery Hill, launched when he heard Johnson open fire on the far left, not only accomplished a deeper penetration, but also came even closer than Wright's had done 2 hours ago to achieving a complete breakthrough and the consequent disruption of Meade's whole fishhook system of defense. His 4 brigades were from 4 different states: Virginia, Louisiana, North Carolina, and Georgia. Gordon commanded the last of these, and the other 3 were respectively under William Smith, Harry T. Hayes, and Isaac Avery. Smith had no share in the assault, having been posted 2 miles out the York Pike to fend off a rumored threat to the rear. Nor did Gordon, as the thing turned out. Early held him in reserve. But the North Carolinians and Louisianians did all they could in fury and hard-handed determination to make up for these subtractions. Hayes advanced on the right and Avery on the left, headed straight for the steep northeast face of the 100-foot hill, and neither brigade would be stopped. Avery fell at the outset, mortally wounded, but his men kept going over and past 3 successive lines of bluecoats disposed behind stone walls, defying the frantic overhead fire of infantry and artillery massed on the summit. Hayes, a Tennessee-born and Mississippi-raised New Orleans lawyer, whose brigade had first won fame under Richard Taylor in the Shenandoah Valley, refused to be outdone. though he too had to contend with 3 successive blue lines, the first along the far side of a ravine at the foot of the hill, the second behind a stone wall halfway up, and the third in well-dug rifle pits just short of the crest, protected by an abattis of felled trees. Losses were surprisingly light, partly because the downhill firing Federals tended to overshoot the climbing graybacks, but mostly, as Hayes said later, because of the darkness of the evening now verging into night and the deep obscurity afforded by the smoke. Another reason was that the defenders here were Howard's men, who had yesterday's disaster fresh in mind. Hayes called no names, merely reporting that his troops, having taken the 3rd Yankee line at small cost to themselves, found many of the enemy who had not fled hiding in the pits for protection. While these were being rousted out and told to make their own way to the rear as prisoners, the 2 rebel brigades surged over the lip of the plateau in hot pursuit of the fugitive survivors. One armed Howard was there, again the unhappy witness of a scene that by now was becoming familiar. Almost before I could tell where the assault was made, he afterwards declared, our men and the Confederates came tumbling back together. Once more, having failed to stem the rout, he was left with the choice of joining it or exposing himself to capture, along with the guns his cannoneers had abandoned when the attackers reached point-blank range. At that time, Hayes noted proudly, every piece of artillery which had been firing upon us was silent. The Louisianians and Tar Heels swarmed among them, in full possession of the Union stronghold at the bend of the 3-mile fish-hook. Like right before him, a mile to the south, though darkness permitted him no such view of the enemy rear, Hayes experienced a feeling of elation as he looked about the plateau for the reinforcements he had been told to expect. For a moment he thought he saw them. Heavy masses of infantry were coming up from the southwest in the gloom. He could not be sure they were not Federal, in which case he would take them under fire, but he had been cautioned to expect friends from that direction, either Longstreet or Hill or Rhodes from his own corps. Even when they fired at him, dropping a number of his men, he did not shoot back, not wanting to compound the error if they were Confederates. They fired again and kept coming on through the darkness. Still he held his fire, perhaps remembering the fall of Jackson in the Wilderness 2 months ago tonight. A third volley crashed, much nearer now, and he saw by the fitful glare of the muzzle flashes that the uniforms were blue. A close look even showed the trefoil insignia of the 2nd Corps on the flat-top forage caps of the still advancing Federals, whose clubs or trumps motto Hayes and his men knew only too well from hard experience. They were, in fact, S.S. Carroll's brigade of Hancock's 3rd Division, and Hancock himself had sent them. He'd been talking just now with Gibbon in the twilight, gazing westward from the point on Cemetery Ridge where Wright's breach had been sealed, when the racket of Early's attack erupted on the north slope of Cemetery Hill. We ought to send some help over there, he told Gibbon, who was acting as corps commander while his chief undertook the larger duties Meade had assigned him. As the uproar drew nearer, signifying the progress of the attackers, Hancock added with rapid decision, "Send a brigade. Send Carroll." Carroll it was, and Hayes, already staggered by the 3 unanswered volleys, the 3rd had been especially destructive, delivered as it was at such close range, gave the order at last for his men to return the fire. This they did, glad to be released from hard restraint, and kept it up as fast as they could ram cartridges and draw triggers, bringing the blue mass to a stumbling halt. Beyond it, however, Hayes could see other such masses forming in the flame-stabbed darkness. Howard's fugitives were rallying to support the troops who had opened ranks to let them through and then gone on to stop the rebels in their tracks. Looking back over his shoulder for some sign that Gordon was advancing, and wishing fervently that at any moment he would see Rhodes and his 5 brigades come charging across the plateau from the west, Hayes held his own for a time against the odds, but then, abandoning all hope of support, gave the necessary commands for a withdrawal. Unpursued past the line of abandoned guns, the 2 brigades fell back in good order, firing as they went, and called a halt at the bottom of the hill, angry that neither Gordon nor Rhodes had mounted the slope to help them exploit the greatest opportunity of the day. This lack of support, which if supplied might well have made up for all the miscalculations and fumbled chances of the past 2 days, resulted from a series of interrelated hesitations and downright failures of nerve on the part of several men. Early had withheld Gordon because he saw at the last moment that Rhodes was not advancing on his right, and Rhodes had called off his attack for the same reason with regard to Lane. In a sense, it all went back to the fall of Penda and the curious defection of Mahone, or perhaps it went even further back than that, to the near escape from disaster Rhodes had experienced yesterday. Restrained at first by a fear of being involved in another fiasco if he charged unsupported up Cemetery Hill, he now was prodded by a desire to retrieve what his restraint had cost him. When he heard the clatter and gunfire on the overhead plateau, which signified unmistakably that the blue defenses had been breached, he repented his inaction and decided to go forward anyhow, with or without support. But by the time he got his troops in position to advance, most of them had been waiting all day in Gettysburg itself, which meant that they had to be disentangled from the complex of streets and houses before they could form for attack. The hilltop clatter had subsided. Hayes had brought his 2 brigades back down the northeast slope. Rhodes took a careful, close-up look at the objective, which bristled with guns, and decided, no doubt wisely at this late hour, that it would be a useless sacrifice of life to go on. However, instead of bringing his 5 brigades back to their various starting points, he put them in line along the hollow of an old roadbed southwest of town, a position he later reported from which I could readily attack without confusion. He did not explain why he had not done this sooner in order to be able to move promptly in support of Hayes, but he added, everything was gotten ready to attack at daybreak. So he said, but for now the fighting was over, all but the final stages of Johnston's blind assault on Old Man Green's well-engineered entrenchments a mile across the way. Presently this too sputtered into silence, and moonlight glistened eerily on the corpse-strewn valleys and hillsides, its refulgence no longer broken by the fitful and ubiquitous pinkish-yellow stabs of muzzle flashes. Here and there the wounded troubled the stillness with their cries for water and assistance, but for the most part the veterans of both armies were inured to this by now. They slept to rest their minds and bodies for tomorrow. Thus ended the second day of what was already the bloodiest battle of the war to date, with no one knew how much more blood still to be shed on this same field. Their lines drawn helter-skelter in the darkness, the soldiers could sleep, but not the 2 commanders and their staff, who had the task of assessing what had been done today or left undone in order to plan for tomorrow. In this, the 2 reacted so literally in accordance with their native predilections, Lee's for daring, Meade's for caution, that afterwards, when their separate decisions were examined down the tunnel of the years, which provides a diminished clarity, not unlike that afforded by a reversed telescope, both would be condemned for having been extreme in these 2 different respects. Lee had spent the battle hours at his command post on Seminary Ridge, midway of that portion of the line occupied by Hill's 2 divisions. And though this gave him a clear view of most of the fighting in the valley below and on the ridge across the way, he had made no attempt to control or even influence the action once the opening attack had been launched on the far right. An observer who was with him recorded that he sent only 1 message and received only 1 all afternoon, despite what another witness described as an expression of painful anxiety on his face as the assault rolled north toward its breakdown, just at the point where he stood between Anderson and Pender, with Mahone's brigade taking it easy in the woods directly behind the command post, then shifted across to Culp's Hill and moved back toward him through the gathering dusk, only to stall again when it got to Rhodes. Both breakdowns were particularly untimely, since in each case they had occurred at the moment when the echelon build-up of pressure resulted at last in a penetration of the enemy's defenses, hard by the point that had been scheduled to be struck next. If there was bitter mockery in these 2 near successes, which had had to be abandoned for lack of support, There was also much encouragement in the overall results of the 5-hour contest. All that had been lacking, Lee perceived and later reported, was proper concert of action. Substantial lodgements had been effected and maintained by Hood and Johnson on the far right and far left. Meade was clamped as in a vice. Moreover, high ground along the Emmitsburg Road had been taken by McLaws in the vicinity of the Peach Orchard, which afforded good positions for the massing of artillery to support an attack on the enemy's center or left center. It was just at that point, shortly before sundown and directly opposite the command post, that Lee had focused his binoculars to watch Wright's Georgians storm Cemetery Ridge, driving off the defending infantry and cannoneers, and then stand poised on the crest for a long moment as if balanced on a knife blade before they had to fall back for want of support. What had almost been achieved today could be achieved tomorrow, Lee believed, with proper concert of action and artillery support. Basically, what he intended was a continuation of the tactics employed today. Longstreet and Ewell would strike simultaneously on the right and left, driving for the Tawnytown Road and the Baltimore Pike just in rear of their primary objectives, while Hill stood by to assist either or both in exploiting whatever opportunities proceeded from the exertion of this double pressure on an enemy Lee presumed was badly shaken by the headlong routs and heavy losses of the last 2 days. Not that there was no room for doubt or occasion for hesitation. There was indeed. If the fighting today had shown nothing else, it certainly had shown that this was a difficult undertaking. However, the situation was not without its compensations and attractions from the Confederate point of view. In at least one sense, the very strength of the close-knit Federal position worked to the disadvantage of the men who occupied it, and this was that any collapse at all was likely to be total and disastrous. Lee could never forget the breakthrough Hood and Law had scored a year ago at Gaines Mill, where they had launched a frontal assault on Turkey Hill under conditions not unlike those the Army faced at Gettysburg. What he hoped for, in short, was a repetition of that exploit tomorrow by Pickett. That general had marched his 3 Virginia brigades to within 3 miles of the field by 6 o'clock, an hour and a half before sunset. But when he notified Lee of his arrival and asked if he was to press on and join the battle he could hear raging toward its climax just ahead, Lee had sent him instructions to go into bivouac where he was, apparently wanting the men to be fully rested for the work he already had in mind for them tomorrow. These 5,000 soldiers would come a good deal short of making up for the nearly 9,000 who had fallen here today, not to mention the nearly 8,000 who had fallen or been captured the day before. But there were others to be taken into account in comparing the force of the blow he planned to strike with the one he'd struck already, which had failed. In addition to Pickett, whose newly arrived division would supply the extra power Lee believed would ensure an initial breakthrough, 2 of Hill's divisions and 1 of Ewell's had taken little or no part in the fighting today, and the same could be said of 2 of Anderson's brigades, 2 of Early's, and 1 of Johnson's. Longstreet alone had put in all the men he had on hand. In point of fact, only 16 of the Army's 37 infantry brigades had been seriously engaged today, which left 21 presumably well rested for tomorrow. Moreover, Stuart's 3 veteran brigades of cavalry would also be available. 2 had arrived by sundown, and the 3rd was expected before sunrise to harry the retreat of whatever remnant of the Blue Army survived the collapse that would attend a rapid exploitation of Pickett's breakthrough. Such then were the factors that contributed to Lee's decision to renew the attack next morning. All this seemed not only possible, but persuasive to a man who had determined to stake everything on one blow, and whose confidence in his troops, they will go anywhere and do anything if properly led, had been strengthened by the sight of what they had accomplished rather than weakened by the thought of what they'd failed to accomplish because of a lack of concert on the part of their commanders. Just as yesterday's successes had led to a continuation of the offensive today, so did today's successes, such as they were, lead to a continuation of the offensive tomorrow. And both were part of what would be met in the years ahead when it came to be said of Lee that the stars had fought against him in Pennsylvania. By midnight, when he retired to his tent to get some sleep, his plans had been developed in considerable detail. A message had gone to Ewell instructing him to open the action on the left at daybreak, and another to Hill, directing him to detach 2 brigades from Rhodes to reinforce Johnson on Culp's Hill for that purpose, while Pendleton had been told to advance the artillery, under cover of darkness, into positions from which to support the attack on the left and right and center. No orders reached Longstreet, however, nor was Pickett alerted for the night march he would have to make if he was to have any share in the daybreak assault. Perhaps this was an oversight, or perhaps Lee had decided by then to attack at a later hour and thus give his troops more rest, though if so he neglected to inform Ewell of the change. In any event, none of the 3 corps commanders visited headquarters that evening to discuss their assignments for tomorrow. Lee neither summoned them nor rode out to see them, and though he sent instructions to Ewell and Hill, he did not get in touch with Longstreet at all, apparently being satisfied that the man he called his old warhorse would know what was expected of him without being told. Across the way on Cemetery Ridge, the Northern leader was taking no such chances. An hour before Lee retired for the night, Meade assembled his corps commanders for a council of war in the headquarters cottage beside the Tawnytown Road. He sent for them not only because he wanted to make sure they understood their duties for tomorrow, but also because he wanted to confer with them as to what those duties should be. Moreover, he wanted their help in solving a dilemma in which he'd placed himself earlier that evening, the unguarded victim of his own enthusiasm. Elated by Warren's success in holding Little Round Top, as well as by Hancock's subsequent ejection of the rebels who pierced his center near sundown, he'd gotten off an exultant message to Halleck. "The enemy attacked me about 4 p.m. this day," he wrote, "and after one of the severest contests of the war, was repulsed at all points." This last was untrue, and he knew it, though he might contend that, strictly speaking, neither the Devil's Den nor the Peach Orchard was an integral part of his fishhook system of defense. In any case, he closed the dispatch with a flat assurance: "I shall remain in my present position tomorrow, but am not prepared to say, until better advised of the condition of the Army, whether my operations will be of an offensive or defensive character." The courier had scarcely left with the message. It was headed 8 p.m. when Johnson's attack exploded on the right. His troops swarmed into and along the trenches Slocum had vacated half an hour before, and while their advance was being challenged by Wadsworth and Greene, Early struck hard at Cemetery Hill, driving Howard's panicky troops from the entrenchments on the summit. Thanks to Hancock, the nearer of these 2 dangers was repulsed, at least for the time, but the Graybacks maintained the lodgment they had effected at the far end of the line. To Meade, this meant that his position, already penetrated twice today, however briefly, first left, then right of center, was gravely menaced at both extremities, from the Devil's Den, hard up against Little Round Top, and on Culp's Hill itself. The inherent possibilities were unnerving. Though he ordered Slocum to return to the far right with all his troops and prepare to oust the rebels at first light, Meade now began to regret the flat assurance he had given Halleck that he would not budge from where he was. He foresaw disaster, and not without cause. 5 days in command, he already had suffered about as many casualties as the bungling Hooker had lost in 5 whole months, and it appeared fairly certain that he was going to suffer a good many more tomorrow. In fact, considering what Lee must have learned today from his exploratory probes of the Union fishhook, it was by no means improbable that he had plans for breaking it entirely. And if that happened, the chances were strong that the Army of the Potomac would be abolished right here in its new commander's own home state. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed to me that the best way to avoid that catastrophe would be to pull out before morning and retire to the Pipe Creek line, which had seemed to him much superior in the first place. By now, moreover, his chief of staff, Daniel Butterfield, had completed the formal orders for withdrawal. They could be issued without delay. As for his untimely assurance to Washington, "I shall remain in my present position tomorrow," it occurred to him that a negative vote on the matter by his corps commanders would release him from his promise. Accordingly, he sent word for them to come to headquarters at once for a council of war. All 7 came, and more. Pleasanton was off on cavalry business. He later testified he'd been ordered to prepare for covering the withdrawal. But since Hancock and Slocum had brought Gibbon and Williams along, 9 generals were present in addition to Meade and his 2 staff advisors, Butterfield and Warren. A dozen men made quite a crowd in the little parlor, which measured barely 10 feet by 12, and whose furnishings included a deal table in the center with a cedar water bucket, a tin cup, and a pair of lighted candles on it, a somewhat rickety bed in one corner, and 5 or 6 chairs. These last were soon filled, as was the bed, which served as a couch, leaving 3 or 4 of the late arrivals, or their juniors, with nothing to sit on but the floor. A witness remarked afterwards that for all their rank, those in attendance were as modest and unpretentious as their surroundings, and as calm and mild-mannered and as free from flurry or excitement as a board of commissioners met to discuss a street improvement. By 11 o'clock all were there. Meade opened the council by announcing that he intended to follow whatever line of action was favored by a majority of those present. Then he submitted 3 questions for a formal vote. 1. Under existing circumstances, is it advisable for this army to remain in its present position or to retire to another nearer its base of supplies? 2. It being determined to remain in present position, shall the army attack or wait the attack of the enemy? 3. If we wait attack, how long? As was the custom in such matters, the junior officer voted first, the senior last. From Gibbon through Slocum, with Butterfield keeping tally, all 9 agreed that the army should neither retreat nor attack. Only on the 3rd question was there any difference of opinion, and this varied from Slocum's "stay and fight it out" to Hancock's "can't wait long," which perhaps was some measure of how much fighting each had done already. At any rate, Meade had his answer. His lieutenants, having declined to take him off the hook, the assurance he had given Halleck remained in effect. "Well, gentlemen," he said when all the votes were in, "the question is settled. We will remain here." By now it was midnight. On the far side of the valley, Lee had retired, and on this side the Union Council of War was breaking up. As the generals were departing to rejoin their commands along and behind the 3-mile curve of line, Meade stopped Gibbon, whose troops were posted on the nearby crest of Cemetery Ridge, due west of the headquarters cottage. "If Lee attacks tomorrow, it'll be in your front," he told him. Gibbon asked why he thought so. "Because he's made attacks on both our flanks and failed," Meade said. "And if he concludes to try it again, it'll be on our center." Nearly a quarter-century later, Gibbon recalled his reaction to this warning that it was his portion of the fishhook line that Lee would strike at. "I expressed the hope that he would, and told General Meade with confidence that if he did, we would defeat him.